Welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. We're all about the places where design and development overlap. We talk with the industry experts about trends in design, development, and take a look at new ways to build digital experiences, typically over a beer or two. This is episode 4 or 5, the recording under quarantine. There's 2 dogs, a baby, multiple people roaming about my house. So we may get some weird audio during this, but we're really excited to talk to Varun Bachar. He's the director of UI architecture at Wrangle. Wrangle is an agency specializing in front-end customer experience. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Knapsack. Check us out at knapsack.cloud or at knapsackcloud. Varun, welcome. So glad we were able to make this happen.
Thank you for having me.
So just kind of kicking things off, before the show, we were talking about some topics, and you brought up some really interesting things that you wanted to chat about today, largely about tools, about the way that you think about design, and a lot of these kind of more computational and graph effects that we get out of design systems. And so let's set the stage here. Let me understand more about how you think about tools for design systems and how your kind of thinking around tools has evolved.
I first got introduced to the idea of design systems through CSS libraries like Rebase and Tachyons. And that's when I started thinking about, how do you build UIs with some constraints in mind? And that's largely been the foundation of how I've approached building UI since then. Over the years, got to try a lot of different tools. And more recently, I've settled on the idea of something called the design graph, which is what we used to refer to as design systems. Obviously, design systems mean a lot more than just sort of the building of the UI piece now. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking at tools that are using design graphs and letting you build UI components by using that constraint-based idea.
So talk to me a little bit about like the word graph inside of that, right? Like design systems, people understand design systems as a systematic approach to design, development, documentation, those sorts of things. What differs there between just a design system and a design graph? I
should just give a shout out to Brent Jackson, who came up with the term and a lot of the thinking around that. So really, for me, it is kind of similar to how we think about data. There's sort of the traditional relational model, and then there's sort of the graph databases. Mm-hmm. Design graph is sort of taking that approach and applying it to UI. So it's largely comprised of 4 different layers. Scales, so defining all visual characteristics in some kind of scale. So a typography scale, a white space scale, color palette, all that kind of stuff. Then you combine all of those scales into themes. So you might have a light theme, a dark theme. Your different brands might have different themes, and these are just a composition of all the different scales that you have. And then variants, which you pick a few different values on the scale together. So for example, if you're defining typography, generally you want to have a font size, a line height, a font weight, all kind of paired together, and that could be a variant.
So that grouping, that collection of things together is what makes up this variant. And so you've defined this scale, you've sort of defined the breadth of the thing, and now you're actually taking like a little bit more specific pieces of that.
Yeah, exactly. I find the design tool analogy works quite well here. So the way you would define typography styles in Figma or Sketch, so you would go in, you would select a text node, and everything that's applied to that text node becomes a typography style. That's exactly what you would call a variant in a design graph.
Gotcha.
And then the last layer is components. So you take all of these different layers, the scales, the themes, the variants, and there can be sort of multiple compositions that you create. And the relationship between that and a component are sort of many to one. So a component can be referring to multiple scales, multiple themes, and multiple variants, and in the end, render something onto the screen.
Cool. So it's basically like you said, it's that constraint, like systems thinking attached to a design systems concept. And it sort of seems to formalize a lot of these things that are very informal, at least how I think of them as being informal now. It reminds me a lot of, did you read the design systems book that was put out by the GitLab folks? I've mentioned it a couple of times on the podcast now, Tori Davis and Sarah Veselov. They talk about the construction of their components in a very similar way, where you think about these like kind of core elements building up to almost this like framework model for a design system.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not familiar with the book. Definitely looking forward to checking that out. But yeah, that's exactly the idea, that you now have a framework to think about, reason about your UI.
Gotcha. So how does this change things? What does this mean when you take this approach versus your standard, like, hey, I have a bunch of symbols in Sketch and a way of organizing them, or I have a bunch of code in React and a way of organizing it. When you apply this more systematically, what is the result of that?
Yeah, I find that you have to be really intentional. So in some ways, like we've always used variables when it comes to creating UI, and at some point you kind of ask yourself, so what's the difference between variable and design tokens? And really, for me, it comes down to intentionality. With variables, you can always introduce a new variable. You can always change the value of a variable and not have to worry about necessarily what kind of rippling effect it would have on your entire system. But if you, let's say you have a typography scale that has values that go, say, 12 pixels, 14 pixels, and 16 pixels, and then suddenly you get a design that introduces a 13 pixel font size, you have to kind of make that intentional choice. Do you actually introduce that into your scale, or do you pick a value that is closest to it that's existing in your scale already? And that's where I find inconsistencies kind of creep into your UI, and over time, as multiple engineers and designers work on a product, it's hard to make sure that they're all aligned to the same consistencies and the same product guidelines.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to one of the real criticisms of design systems, is that if you think about a design system as a system for managing all the possible variants of things inside of your UI, you end up in a situation where you can make that just as fragmented as any other experience that you would have built without the design system. And so that pushing back against fragmentation is a big theme that we've kind of been hitting on over the past couple of pods, is trying to understand the idea of how do you be more intentional about the choices you make in your design system. So you're not just taking things that were fragmented at an end product state and refragment them into a design system state.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find that by naming things and putting them into these buckets, you start to reason through them, right? Like, is something a scale? Is that scale tied to a theme, which is tied to maybe one product or a sub brand or the master brand, all those different layers? And you can start visualizing the links between these different things. So how does something flow from, something that might be part of your brand guidelines that's owned by the marketing department into an actual digital product, which is an application that the user interacts with?
So when you think about these connections that you're making between these people, you're able to sort of like audit this thread of understanding where this experience came from. And that's very similar in my mind to a lot of what we think about when we talk about agile software development, right? Like you want to have an auditable requirement that is equated to a test, which is equated to production code. Sort of thinking about it the same way, but just within the idea of a design system and incorporating that design part of it into that process. So, why do you need a 13-point font instead of a 14 or a 16? And trying to understand where that requirement came from that ideation stage all the way into ultimately what became production code.
Yeah, absolutely. I find design systems definitely help designers and developers build more consistently and even sort of speeds up the work that they're doing. But it's also a great way to surface some of those organizational tensions where teams are making these choices and it's often not clear who made that choice or where that requirement came from. And just by forcing it through this systemized thinking, you kind of just surface that there might be a choice that's made here that doesn't align with the larger picture, or that larger picture is now shifting to a new standard and we need to update our thinking to match that.
Gotcha. And so, I've looked at, for example, process flows that exist online that I think you guys created, and there's some that Brad Frost has published that are out there that are kind of all about like what makes something a valid, like what makes it pass the muster to be included in the design system. And that is, it's going to be repeated on more than one product. It's going to be repeated more than, say, 4 times within a product. Is there anything that you set as kind of a rule of thumb for how you think about inclusion in a design system? So if I do want a 13-point font, what is the intentional choice that I'm really making? Is it that a 13-point font is usable across more than one product? Is it, this has got 16 different use cases inside our product? What kind of barometer do you have there?
So working at an agency, we've helped out with a lot of design systems. And what I've realized is I don't think there is necessarily one right answer to that. The important thing is having an answer to that. So having that governance model, the contribution model defined, which helps you answer that question. When do we add something to the design system? Or can we define a criteria for it? Is it about the number of product that it's being used in, or a number of features in a product? Both of those are right answers. It could be that just everything goes in the design system. Really comes down to organizational requirements. But I definitely would say that having that defined is really important, having some kind of framework that lets you make that choice.
So you've built a lot of these design system tool sets from within Wrangle. Talk to me about how your thinking around tooling has evolved and maybe what you're working on there to try to help solve this problem for some of your customers and honestly, the community at large.
So for me personally, it really started off with CSS. I often kind of worked in tandem with visual designers, and CSS was a bit of a shared concern. So it was always sort of a back and forth in choices that the visual designer is making. How are we going to implement that in code? And let's try to set some constraints around that. And then over the years, as the JavaScript framework sort of adopted the component model, design tools like Sketch introduced the symbol model, and then later Figma with the component-based model, I realized that kind of designers and developers started thinking in the same way. We had a shared mental model. So we started adopting tools that allowed us to have that shared mental model. I definitely found that using sort of tools like React and Angular definitely helped us push towards thinking about the UI in individual components and then sort of composing those components into larger level features.
It's interesting how that sort of serendipitously or maybe intentionally came to pass for both design and development tools. Like there was definitely a front end revolution that happened over the past, 5 or 6 years with the advent of JavaScript frameworks really taking control of the front end of the web. And then as a second aspect of that, design tools really kind of getting with the idea of modularity and reusability inside of design land. And so that sort of collision, I guess, of what was happening in the developer world and what was happening in the designer world really kind of made this perfect storm for these more systematic approaches. I oftentimes wonder if that was the intent from the start or if that just happened as a factor of the design and development zeitgeist kind of thinking about the same thing at the same time.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but I'm really glad that it did happen.
Yeah, it kind of enables all of these new ideas. Yeah, so talk to me about some of the specific stuff you guys have created at Wrangle. I know I've checked out Radius. What's that all about?
So what we found was obviously the requirements for different organizations are completely different, but there were certain things that were coming up quite a lot or certain tools that we were reaching for quite often. So what we decided to do was essentially take a lot of these open source tools and package them up in a way that it that solves a sort of that foundational piece of a design system. So we largely built it around React and style components and style system on the technology side, and then Figma on the design tooling side, and then Storybook as sort of the dev environment and a really sort of minimal version of a documentation site. That's
awesome. And so this basically hands people a starting point, and that common starting point is a set of tools that lets you say, like, I can get started with my design system based on this baseline understanding of what needs to be a part of it. Yeah, exactly. There's sort of a lot of common challenges that you have to solve. So even if you're building a design system in React, how do you build that component library and distribute it through NPM? What kind of testing are you going to do around it? And then sort of a core set of components that you end up with in every single design system. So things like buttons or typography components or form elements. So just having some of those recipes at the foundational level. Yeah, as an aside, we should totally look at a collaboration with Knapsack on that. It'd be awesome to include a bunch of that stuff as a set of baseline components inside of Knapsack. Absolutely. And I find that the documentation side is sort of one of the harder problems to solve. And Storybook is a really great way to get started. But quite often you want to open it up to a wider audience and get authors who are maybe from a non-technical background to contribute to it. And then having tools like Knapsack, or InVision DSM just opens it up a little bit more. So being able to expand to more tooling. Gotcha. Totally. I love the work that Storybook has done. And in particular, their ability to have popularized the component-based approach inside of JavaScript frameworks has been really incredible for our industry. I think it's interesting that they did decide to kind of double down on the developer crowd, where that is really their channel. And adding MDX is a super powerful feature, but it's definitely a very developer-centric feature. And so it's one of those things that having your documentation embedded in your code is super powerful if you're a developer, but it definitely maybe doesn't feel quite as enabling if you're a designer and not in React every day. Yeah, absolutely. Big fan of MDX, super powerful, but the downside is it just ramps up the complexity level of maintaining that documentation quite a bit. So if you want designers to jump into a Markdown file, that's one thing, but now Markdown file with React components all over it, that adds another layer of complexity to it. So you also had brought up this idea of computational design as something you wanted to talk about. And this is fascinating to me because I haven't I've heard of this before. I have not had the opportunity to dive into this at all. And so I'm really eager to hear like what this is all about for you and how this relates back to some of the stuff you're doing in design systems.
I find that computational design has been around for a while. It's used a lot in architecture, but for UI design, it's still a fairly new practice and doesn't have a lot of definition around it. But for me, I have a good analogy for it. I started off my programming career through something called generative art. So doing a lot of animations and 3D graphics built using code. And that was sort of like going from using something like an Illustrator to a tool like processing for computational graphics was like a massive jump, where I'm still largely doing the same thing, but instead of drawing those paths manually, I'm writing code that generates that, which means I can go through thousands of different variations in a really short time, compare them and pick the most ideal version, or even write some kind of framework around it, which automatically makes those choices. And I find that computational design for UI is going to enable us to do that, where a lot of our design tools right now focus on describing UI in terms of geometry, but computational design suddenly allows us to describe UI in terms of logic, where we have these components already. We can start setting some characteristic around these components and then feeding, let's say, a block of content, and then the algorithm that you create might be able to pair the right type of component to the right kind of content block.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's interesting. We were talking to Adam Argyle last week, and he was talking about the idea of having machine learning generate thousands of different computed layouts for your website, and then recognizing the fact that, you know, the vast majority of those are going to be throwaway. You're going to have, you know, 1,000 different layouts, maybe a dozen or so that aren't bad. But the idea of having a mathematical algorithm that you can use to generate design, and then being able to teach an AI to generate better computational layouts for you, is kind of an interesting idea, where you could think about some future where you're able to pair the data you could gather about how a design system is being able to be used, and even how it converts in user land, to really understand, like, okay, if I can create math that is able to generate this design stuff for me, how those two things could interrelate. Or you could actually have a lot of robots basically deciding on some of your design patterns. And then you could also have this idea, and I know I'm kind of going tangent on you here, you could also have this idea of experience personalization, which is something that I've always thought would be a really cool way of thinking, right? Like, if you have this experience that you've created, right now we're pretty good at understanding like how I change my content to fit inside of that experience based upon my user segment or whatever, right? Like if I'm from Oregon and I'm visiting a site about tourism, it'd be great to get content sent to me that is about Oregon. If you're from, Toronto, you would want to have something that is, potentially Toronto based. But we don't do a really great job of thinking about this in terms of the experience, right? Like maybe Canada has a different design aesthetic than the Pacific Northwest of the United States. Maybe there's a different way that information is presented based upon, the way that Canadians pay for things, or the way that Americans pay for things. That sense of changing an experience to match a user is something we still haven't really nailed, I think, as an industry yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen a few experiments. The one that comes to my mind is Project Phoebe, that was developed by Google, where they adopted this idea of mutative design, exactly kind of the idea that you described, where if you think about an application allows a user to complete different types of tasks, if you break those down into what the user is allowed to achieve and sort of what the requirements are for that particular user, and you can start pairing the two together. So as the user interacts with the application, you can start changing the UI to morph to what they're trying to do more often. Siri shortcuts is another really good example of that, where your phone kind of tracks what are you doing over and over again, and then makes recommendations for, do you want to create a shortcut for that? Now, applying that and extending that to the UI of an application, I feel like that could be really powerful.
Definitely. And I think it would let you kind of think about how you level up on an accessibility side as well, right? Where if you're able to basically say, I can personalize experiences based upon the needs of my particular users, I guess that's inherently creating a more accessible experience for people.
Absolutely, because then accessibility just becomes another sort of variable in the characteristics that you're tracking.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that it's a wild thought to think about a future where a lot of the design choices are made for us by robots that honestly know better because they can see things that we can't inside of the data. And I wonder where that leaves some people that are like, hey, this is scary, right? Like, are we over algorithming our lives to extend it to the field of design, which has traditionally been a very human discipline?
Right. I think it's sort of important to keep in mind that it's not necessarily you're leaving all the decision making up to an algorithm, but you're kind of creating an algorithm that feeds in a lot of the choices, a lot of the philosophy of your product, and then making choices based on that for you, or giving you a lot of different variations, and then you can pick from that which one you want to use most often. I think a good example of that would be the Wox homepage. They publish a lot of stories every day, and the layout needs to kind of evolve to fit the content in the most appropriate manner. So they created a system that lets them rank each layout, and then the algorithm just sort of goes through a lot of different variations, and it calculates a score for each variation, and the one with the highest score kind of wins out, and that's the output that's displayed. Obviously, not going to be perfect in 100% of scenarios, but it's a good starting point, and it takes away a lot of that tedious, repetitive work that designers are otherwise doing manually.
Much like how, that question of what I do with my hands, as Dan Mall puts it, and thinking about like, how do I interact in this world where I'm being presented with all of these different options and choices? It really is about a decision aid more than anything else. It's about understanding that like there are things as a designer that my capacity is limited towards, and this helps us uncover or discover new ways of thinking that maybe we wouldn't have discovered on our own.
Absolutely. I find that if you're kind of going through those iterations manually, there's only so much you can do. But if you leverage the power of computers, you can run through hundreds and thousands of simulations and get to a lot more choices that you wouldn't have considered manually otherwise.
So say I want to play around with this. How do I get started?
Well, that's the $1 million question. So I don't know if there's necessarily sort of a go-to tool for that right now, but I think we have design systems. We have, especially with tools like Figma, where you have a really robust plugin API and plugin ecosystem. I find that a lot of interesting work is happening there, where you can access all the components that you have in your design assets and start writing some of these custom tooling on top of that lets you, if you have a grid system, automatically place components on that grid system and generate a bunch of different layout options for you, or even start throwing real world content onto components and, testing, what happens. Have you accounted for every single edge case scenario, or running color combinations for accessibility compliance and finding out what combinations are acceptable and pass the different kind of visual requirements that are required.
Yeah, it's interesting. I, again, in the convo with Adam last week, one of the things that he brought up is chaos testing, where if you are able to throw a bunch of nonsense at a component, how broken does it get? And what is the acceptable level of broken inside of that? And a lot of that thought process comes from the idea of user-generated content, right? Where like, if you don't have control over who's creating your content, how do you actually make sure that you have a system that is bulletproof enough to handle all the bullets that the users are shooting at it? You could think about how you could definitely aid in a chaos test with something that is more computational in nature.
Absolutely, yeah. And then the other thing you can kind of do is capture a lot of crowdsourced data and feed that into machine learning models. So one of my favorite examples of this is color combinations that are aesthetically pleasing but are also accessibility compliant. That's a hard problem, and not necessarily an algorithm you can throw at it. So there's an open source project that just gets users to rate whether a color combination is accessible enough from a contrast perspective, and secondly, is it aesthetically pleasing or not. And then over the years, it's just been gathering thousands and millions of those submissions and feeding that into a machine learning model. You're able to get something that's able to then recommend new colors to you that you might not have considered otherwise.
That's amazing. I want that built into my design system right now. Well, so you've been talking a lot about kind of the ways that you use code to help with design. Now, I know you have some personal projects that you're also doing this with that's related to pen plotting. Maybe explain what that's all about.
Sure. So a few months ago, I discovered this Twitter hashtag called PlotterTwitter, and I went down a rabbit hole, and it's just this amazing supportive community of people who use essentially robots to draw pictures. So I bought this tool called AxiDraw. It's a pen plotter. What it lets you do is feed in an SVG, and then essentially it's just the plotter is a couple of motors that control a pen, and the pen just plots out the SVG path.
That's totally interesting. See, I'm really into 3D printing myself, which is, I guess, in a way, a sort of similar thing where, you have a laser with XY coordinates on a plane, and you're drawing layer by layer these really complex 3D objects. I find it oddly satisfying and relaxing when you're able to kind of create your first thing out of your brain and give it form and give it life in this strange medium. Yeah, I assume that that's a similar feeling when you're talking about, like, how do I actually, write a mathematical algorithm that approaches this idea that I have and gives it form.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of weird. I've been doing generative art for a really long time, and stuff that you create, it looks kind of mediocre on a screen, but then you plot it and it just suddenly looks amazing because it's taking something that is very digital and it's being recreated in a medium that's very, very tactile, and it just gives it another layer of interesting qualities that are hard to define, but it does something magical to it.
Yeah, for sure. I totally understand that. Admittedly, like, quick window into the other life I lead, I admittedly make a lot of Dungeons and Dragons minis with my 3D printer, and it's definitely a different feeling when you have that thing that is a digital design that's like this 3D object. It then takes form in the form of this little hunk of plastic that is sculpted in a particular way, and then you end up painting it and then using it in a game. It's a really fascinating transformation of, hey, this digital representation of this thing I'm ultimately going to use in this, like, incredibly personal setting takes form and takes shape. It's totally cool how that transformative process that wasn't really possible before we had computers and these really advanced ways of conceiving of how we do design.
And if anyone's sort of interested in getting into this, I would give a shout out to a tool called Canvas Sketch. It's a creative coding environment that runs in the browser, essentially built by Matt Delaurier. So primarily that's the tool set that I use. Essentially just lets you write a bit of Canvas code that generates SVG files, which you can then send it over to your plotter.
Gotcha. And so you just have to have a plotter that has basically the ability to move a pen around. And I assume that these are just commercially available products that you can buy. And then the thing that you generate out of it, this design, this creation that you have, like, do you have a favorite right now, or do you have a gallery of these that we could see?
I would give a shout out to Tyler Hobbs. He has some really innovative and interesting work done with plotters. My favorite is he figured out how to use a pen plotter with a paintbrush, which is kind of crazy because once the plotter gets going, the pen's just moving around, and but with a paintbrush, you kind of need to pause and go back to the paint pot and reapply the paint. So he created an algorithm that would generate the image, but then the image itself would have sort of these hidden paths, which is accounted for the paintbrush to go back to a corner where the easel is sitting with a little bit of paint. So it dabs into that and then continues drawing. And the end result is you get this oil painting that is completely done by, described in code and then created by this robot, but it looks really, really organic.
No, that's beautiful. I can't wait to check that out. Hey, thanks so much for being on the podcast today. This has been really interesting. Getting to talk about 3 completely new concepts to me has been really educational. I know I've learned a ton, and I just want to say thank you for taking the time to share your knowledge. It's been really awesome.
Thank you. It was really fun chatting with you too.
That's all for today. We'd love to hear from you with questions, ideas for new episodes, beer recommendations, or comments. You can find us on Twitter @TheDSPod. Cheers, and thanks for listening to the Design Systems Podcast.